James had it all, or so it seemed. A beautiful wife, Mary, and a bright, lively daughter named Emma. The house they lived in was a picture of suburban success, nestled in a quiet neighborhood where the lawns were meticulously manicured, and the neighbors exchanged pleasantries every Sunday morning. James often caught himself feeling grateful for the life they had built together, a life that many envied. His job at a respected law firm afforded them the kind of lifestyle others could only dream of. Long weekends at the lake, family vacations, and evenings spent enjoying dinners at their spacious dining table. Everything was orderly, predictable, and comfortable. From the outside looking in, they were the perfect family. At the firm, James had built a reputation for being reliable, diligent, and a team player. His colleagues often complimented him on his work ethic, and he took pride in it. But as the years went by, the accolades and successes began to feel hollow, like a collection of trophies without any true meaning behind them. At home, it was a different story. Mary was always the heart of their home. She had this gentle, almost ethereal way of making everything feel right. Whether she was caring for Emma, decorating their house, or simply sharing a quiet moment with James, she made their life feel complete. They'd been married for 10 years, and it felt like their connection had only grown deeper over time. Every morning, they'd share a cup of coffee before the rush of the day began. Those moments had become something James cherished, a routine that grounded him. But lately, something had changed. It started small, almost imperceptible. The first hint was when Mary began spending more time on her phone. James noticed it during dinner one evening. She was scrolling through it, her focus entirely elsewhere. She'd been a little distracted before, but this time, it felt different. She wasn't as present, and it left a pang in his chest. He dismissed it, thinking it was nothing, maybe just work-related stress, or maybe she was chatting with a friend. But then, there were the quiet moments. When James would ask her how her day went, she'd offer only a half-hearted response. When they'd sit together, watching TV after Emma went to bed, Mary seemed distant, her attention diverted, her eyes glued to her phone. She seemed lost in thought, and it was as if there was a wall between them that wasn't there before. One evening, James came home to find her sitting at the kitchen table, frowning at her phone. She didn't even notice him at first. He stood there, watching her, waiting for her to acknowledge his presence. When she finally looked up, her smile was tight, forced. "How was your day?" he asked, his voice casual. "Fine," Mary replied, almost too quickly. She glanced down at the phone again, and the smile faded. "Anything exciting happening?" James tried again, feeling a strange unease bubbling up inside him. Mary shook her head. "No, just the usual stuff." James couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, but he couldn't quite pinpoint what it was. He made a mental note to keep an eye out, but he didn't want to jump to conclusions. Maybe he was just overthinking it. That night, as they lay in bed, James turned to face Mary. He was about to ask her what was going on when she rolled over, her back to him. It wasn't the first time, but tonight it felt more deliberate. He stared at the ceiling, wondering how everything had seemed so perfect just weeks ago. And then, as the silence stretched on, the question lingered in the back of his mind. What was happening to the life they had built? The days that followed felt like an unspoken tension in the air, an invisible thread pulling at the edges of James's carefully constructed world. The cracks that had first appeared were becoming more noticeable now, impossible to ignore. Mary's behavior, once just a slight shift, was now more pronounced. She wasn't herself, at least, not the version of herself that James had come to know and love. It wasn't just the phone anymore. It was the way she moved through the house, like she was a million miles away. The softness in her voice, the light in her eyes, the laughter they once shared, those things were slowly fading, replaced by a colder, more distant version of the woman he had married. That morning, James noticed it again. He woke up early, as usual, and crept downstairs to make coffee. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a warm golden light over the kitchen. As he stood there, waiting for the coffee to brew, he couldn't help but glance at Mary's phone, which lay on the counter. She'd left it there after getting up earlier, and for some reason, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something he should know, something he was missing. He didn't want to snoop, but his curiosity gnawed at him. He didn't know when it had happened, but somewhere along the way, doubt had planted itself firmly in his mind. What had once been a deep sense of trust now felt fragile, like a thread hanging by a single strand. Before he could talk himself out of it, his fingers hovered over the screen of her phone. He pulled it closer, the weight of his actions settling in his chest. He didn't want to invade her privacy, but the unease was becoming unbearable. The phone unlocked with the swipe of her fingerprint. The first thing that caught his eye was the string of messages from an unknown number. Mary had always been open with her phone, leaving it lying around without fear. But now, the secrecy, no, the intentional hiding, spoke volumes. The messages weren't flirtatious or overly intimate, but there was an unmistakable tone of familiarity. "Can't wait to see you again," one read. Another, "I miss you already. Last night was amazing." James's stomach twisted into a knot. His heart raced, and his hands trembled. He quickly set the phone back down on the counter, like it was suddenly too hot to touch. He took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm of emotions threatening to overwhelm him. He couldn't make sense of it. Could it be a misunderstanding? Was he overreacting? But deep down, something told him that wasn't the case. He had seen this before in the faces of his friends who had gone through the same kind of heartbreak. The silence, the secrecy, the change in behavior, it was all too familiar. Mary had become more distant in recent weeks. She spent late nights at work, something that never used to happen. Even when she was home, she was always distracted, lost in thought, her eyes avoiding his whenever their gazes met. And then, there was the new habit of taking phone calls in the other room, her voice low and hurried. James started replaying every conversation in his head. All the little signs that he had ignored, brushed off as nothing. Maybe they weren't nothing. Maybe they were everything. That night, after dinner, he decided to follow her. It wasn't something he wanted to do. He didn't want to invade her privacy or put himself through the torment of finding out the truth, but he couldn't ignore the feeling that was gnawing at him. He had to know. Mary said she was meeting her sister for drinks. It wasn't unusual. They had done that before. But something about the way she said it, something in her tone, felt off. James's gut was telling him this was more than just a casual evening out. He waited until she was out the door, watching as she got into her car. He grabbed his keys and followed her at a safe distance, his heart pounding. The drive felt long, even though it was only a few miles to the restaurant. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, proof, maybe, but a part of him was still hoping that he was wrong, that he was just overreacting. Mary parked in front of a small, dimly lit restaurant he didn't recognize. His heart skipped a beat. He had never heard her mention this place before. His instinct screamed at him as he parked a few spaces down, out of view. Then James saw her. Mary got out of the car, but she wasn't alone. A man followed her, a man he had never seen before. The way they walked side by side, their shoulders brushing as they spoke, was enough to make James's stomach churn. They were laughing, their eyes locked in a way that was far too intimate for his liking. James's mind was spinning. His worst fear was coming true. He could see it clearly now, the spark in Mary's eyes, the way her lips curled up in a way that was only reserved for him, now directed at this stranger. They entered the restaurant together, and James remained in his car frozen. The images burned into his mind. He had his answers, but they only raised more questions. How had this happened? Was his entire marriage a lie? James could hardly breathe as he sat in his car, staring at the small, dimly lit restaurant where Mary and the stranger had entered. His mind was spinning, each thought more chaotic than the last. He wanted to run after them, confront Mary right then and there, but something held him back. The part of him that still cared for her, the part that was desperate to believe she hadn't betrayed him, urged him to wait, to process what he'd seen before taking any drastic steps. But how could he process it? His entire world was shifting beneath him. All the memories he had of their life together, the quiet mornings, the intimate conversations, the simple joy of raising their daughter, Emma, felt tainted. The laughter they had shared, the promises made, were all unraveling before his eyes. James wasn't sure how long he sat there, immobilized by a mixture of anger, confusion, and heartbreak. The quiet hum of the car's engine was the only sound in the stillness of the night. He couldn't help but replay the images in his mind, Mary and the man, walking close, laughing as if nothing in the world could be wrong. That familiarity between them, the ease with which they interacted, felt like a knife twisting in his gut. He couldn't stand it anymore. He gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white as he forced himself to move. He had to confront her. He had to know the truth. This feeling of uncertainty, of wondering what was going on behind his back, was unbearable. James's heart was racing as he drove home, the thoughts in his head like a storm he couldn't control. The house that had once felt like a sanctuary now seemed suffocating. His mind was screaming at him to act, to find out once and for all what had been going on. He arrived at their house, the lights still on in the windows. The door was unlocked, as it always was. He stepped inside, the quietness of the house sending a chill through him. He could hear the faint sound of Mary's voice coming from the living room, talking on the phone. James stood frozen in the doorway for a moment, listening to her laughter. Her voice was light and carefree, not at all the voice of the woman he had just seen with another man. He knew he had to act quickly. The more he waited, the more his mind would race. The doubt, the fear, the pain, it would only grow. And so, with trembling hands, he walked toward the living room. Mary was sitting on the couch, her back to him. She was holding her phone in one hand, the other propped on the armrest, as she spoke with someone. Her face was illuminated by the soft glow of the screen, her expression warm, content. Everything about her in that moment felt so normal, so unreachable. James cleared his throat, his voice barely a whisper. "Mary?" She looked up, startled. The phone slipped from her hand and landed softly on the cushion beside her. For a split second, James saw panic flicker in her eyes, but she quickly masked it with a smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "James," she said, her tone oddly neutral. "You're home early." "Yeah." His voice cracked slightly as he stepped further into the room, his gaze never leaving her. "I've been thinking, Mary, about everything." Mary's eyes darted nervously. "What about everything?" James could hardly keep his composure as he spoke, his heart pounding in his chest. "About you. About us. I saw you tonight." She froze. He exhaled sharply, his frustration building. "I saw you with him. The man. You two looked pretty cozy together." For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Mary's face went pale, her breath catching in her throat. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. James pressed on, his voice trembling with emotion. "How long has this been going on, Mary? Was I really that blind? All this time, all this love, this trust we built, and you've been seeing someone else?" Tears welled in Mary's eyes, and she stood up, her hands outstretched in an attempt to reach him. "James, please! I'm so sorry. I never meant for this to happen. Sorry? The word burned in his throat as anger and heartbreak surged through him. Sorry doesn't cut it, Mary. You betrayed me. You betrayed us. Mary's face crumpled in despair. I didn't mean for it to get this far. It just happened. James shook his head, the weight of her words crashing down on him. That's what you always say. It just happened. How convenient. His voice was rising now, the pain too much to hold in. I trusted you, Mary. I thought I knew you. I thought we had something special, something real. But you've been hiding this from me, lying to me, and now I don't even know who you are anymore. Mary collapsed onto the couch, burying her face in her hands as she sobbed. James, I made a mistake. I was lonely. You weren't there for me like you used to be. I thought I could find something that I was missing. I was right here, Mary. I've always been right here. His voice was thick with hurt. And you chose to do this. You chose to throw it all away. James's chest felt tight, as though the weight of her betrayal was suffocating him. For a moment, all he could do was stand there, staring at her in disbelief. He wanted to scream, to yell, to demand answers, but instead, he stood frozen, the gravity of the situation too overwhelming to put into words. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of silence, James whispered, I can't do this anymore. The silence that followed James's words felt suffocating. Mary's sobs were the only sound in the room, but they did nothing to ease the storm that raged inside him. His heart was shattered, pieces falling away with each breath he took. He had loved her with every fiber of his being, and now that love felt like a lie, twisted into something unrecognizable. I never wanted to hurt you, James. Mary's voice trembled as she wiped her tears away, her eyes pleading with him. I swear, it wasn't like this at first. It was just a mistake that spiraled out of control. James took a step back, shaking his head in disbelief. A mistake? The word felt like an insult. You've been seeing him behind my back for who knows how long, and you call it a mistake? Mary flinched, her face crumpling again as she tried to find the right words. I was lonely, James. You were so focused on your work, on everything else, that I felt invisible. I didn't know how to get your attention, how to feel seen again. And then he came along, and for the first time in a long time, I felt wanted. James could feel his stomach churn at her words. The truth was like a heavy weight pressing down on him, crushing the air from his lungs. He had been so wrapped up in his own world, his career, his endless striving for success, that he had failed to see the cracks in his marriage. The loneliness that Mary had described wasn't something that just happened overnight. It had been building for months, maybe even years. And now, here he was, standing in the wreckage of the life they had built, trying to understand how everything had gone so horribly wrong. I didn't know, Mary, James whispered, his voice breaking. I didn't know you were feeling this way. I thought we were okay. I thought we were happy. Mary's eyes softened, her expression one of regret. We were, James. We really were. But things changed. I changed. James closed his eyes, as if shutting her out could stop the hurt. He didn't want to hear it anymore. He didn't want to hear the reasons, the excuses. The truth was simple. She had betrayed him. She had chosen to lie, to deceive, and in doing so, she had broken him in a way he didn't know how to fix. His thoughts raced. Emma, their daughter, what would this mean for her? For their family? James's mind kept returning to that image, the one of Mary and the stranger laughing together, so effortlessly close. The hurt that followed wasn't just from the betrayal. It was from the realization that Mary had stopped seeing him. She had stopped caring enough to try. I don't know if I can forgive you for this, Mary, James said, the words coming out as if they were being dragged from him. I don't know if I can ever trust you again." Mary's face twisted in pain, but she didn't argue. She didn't try to defend herself anymore. She knew the damage was done. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness," she whispered. "But I'm sorry. I never meant to hurt you like this. I never wanted to destroy our family." The words felt hollow to James, like an empty promise that couldn't fill the void inside him. The love they had once shared, what was left of it? How could it survive this? Could it survive this? "I don't know what to do," James murmured. "I don't know what comes next." Mary stood up then, hesitantly moving toward him. She reached for his hand, but he pulled away, his chest tight with emotion. He couldn't bear to feel her touch, not now. Not after everything she had done. "I think we need some space," he said, his voice firm, though it wavered with raw emotion. "I can't think straight with you here, with everything hanging between us." Mary nodded, her shoulders slumping in defeat. "I understand. I'll leave. I'll give you the space you need." James could see the defeat in her eyes, the same defeat that mirrored his own. Neither of them knew what would come next. Would they fix their marriage? Could they? Or had the betrayal cut too deep to heal? As Mary left the room, James felt the weight of the decision settle heavily on his shoulders. He was alone now, in a house that had once been filled with warmth and laughter. The silence was deafening, a cruel reminder of the shattered trust between them. His mind swirled with questions he didn't have answers to. What was the next step? Could he move past this? Could they ever rebuild what had been lost? But no answers came. Not yet. All he knew was that the road ahead was uncertain, and that, for now, he needed to be alone. The days following Mary's departure from their shared home felt like an eternity. The house, once a sanctuary, now felt like a foreign place to James. Each room, each corner, was a reminder of everything he had lost, of the trust, the connection, the life he thought they had built together. He barely slept, his mind too busy with thoughts of betrayal, regret, and confusion. The pain was relentless, a dull ache that seemed to take over every waking moment. Emma had been at her friend's house when Mary left, a small blessing in disguise. James didn't know how to explain this to her, how to make her understand the hurt and disappointment that had invaded their home. He couldn't find the words. Every time he thought about how this would affect her, his chest tightened in anguish. He spent his days in a haze of uncertainty, drifting through his work, trying to focus but unable to fully engage. He had tried to contact Mary a few times, but each call went unanswered. He didn't know what to say, and it seemed like she didn't either. The messages he had left her had been filled with anger, confusion, and a touch of sorrow, but she had stayed silent, leaving him with nothing but his own tortured thoughts. But that night, after a long day, the silence was broken. Mary called. Her voice was softer than he had expected. "James," she said, her voice trembling, "I think we need to talk. About everything." James's heart skipped a beat. He didn't know if he was ready for this conversation, but he also knew that avoiding it wouldn't heal anything. He had to face the reality of their situation, painful as it was. He couldn't keep running from the truth. "Where are you?" James asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'm at the apartment," Mary replied, her voice strained. I don't want to do this over the phone. Can we meet? Please?" James hesitated. Every part of him wanted to lash out, to make her feel the pain she had caused. But he knew this conversation would be their only chance to get some clarity, even if it was just for him. He couldn't keep holding on to the anger forever. He had to hear her side of the story, even if it would hurt. "Fine," he said, his voice low. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. When he arrived at the apartment, it felt like stepping into a new world, one that had no place for him. The apartment was sparse, cold, a stark contrast to the home they had shared. Mary was standing by the window, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, staring out into the night. She didn't turn when he entered. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of the silence between them was crushing. Finally, Mary spoke, her voice breaking the stillness. "I never wanted it to get this far, James. I never thought I would hurt you like this." James took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay composed, even though his emotions were boiling inside. "You didn't just hurt me, Mary. You tore everything apart. You shattered my trust, and you made me question everything we had." Mary turned to face him then, her eyes red and swollen from the tears she had no doubt been holding back. "I know," she whispered. "I'm sorry. I don't expect you to forgive me right away. I don't even know if I deserve your forgiveness. But I need you to understand that I never meant for this to happen. It was never about him. It was about me and the emptiness I felt." James's jaw clenched as he took in her words. "So it's my fault? Because I wasn't there for you enough?" The bitterness in his voice was evident, but it was the hurt beneath it that truly cut through. "You made a choice, Mary. You chose to hurt me. You chose to go behind my back, and you chose to lie to me. And now you're trying to blame it on me?" Mary's eyes filled with tears, and she took a step forward. "No, James. I'm not blaming you. I'm just trying to explain. I didn't know how to talk to you. You were so focused on everything else that I felt invisible. And I got lost in it. I don't expect you to understand, but I need you to know it wasn't about him. It was about me feeling like I didn't matter anymore." James stared at her, trying to find the woman he had once known, the woman he had fallen in love with. But all he saw now was someone who had betrayed him, someone who had chosen to find solace in someone else rather than facing their problems together. The woman he had loved was gone, replaced by someone who had made a choice that he could never unmake. "I don't know what to do, Mary," James said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I can ever trust you again. I don't know if I can ever look at you the same way." Mary's shoulders sagged, and she reached out toward him, but he stepped back. The space between them felt wider than ever. "I understand," she said softly, her voice cracking. "I don't expect things to go back to the way they were. But I hope, in time, you can see that I'm sorry. That I never wanted to destroy us." The words hung in the air, but James didn't know if he could accept them. Could he ever rebuild what had been broken? Could he ever trust her again? As he left the apartment, the weight of his decision hung heavy on his shoulders. His world had been shattered, and the future was uncertain. The road ahead wasn't clear, and he wasn't sure if he would ever have the answers he needed. But he knew one thing for certain: he couldn't keep living in the past. It was time for him to find a new path. The weeks that followed James's confrontation with Mary felt like an endless blur. Each day bled into the next, the emotional weight of the past hanging over him like a dark cloud. The house felt quieter now, emptier, his life too. But something inside him had shifted during those painful conversations, something that was both a bitter pill to swallow and a glimmer of hope. He realized that he couldn't allow himself to be consumed by the past. It would have been easy to keep drowning in anger, to let bitterness and resentment rule his every thought. It would have been easy to keep blaming Mary, to keep asking himself what went wrong. But that wouldn't heal him. That wouldn't bring him peace. James knew that he had to choose a different path. The first step was learning how to breathe again, how to reclaim some sense of control in his life. It wasn't easy. There were days when the pain seemed unbearable, when the silence in the house became deafening. There were nights when he would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if he had been a fool to believe in their love so fully. But over time, he started to understand that healing didn't come from blaming anyone. It came from within. James threw himself into his work, not as a distraction, but as a means of rebuilding his own sense of purpose. He had been so focused on his career, on providing, that he had neglected his own needs, his own happiness. Now, he was determined to find that balance again. Slowly, he began to take better care of himself, physically, mentally, emotionally. He joined a gym, something he'd always wanted to do but had pushed aside. He started journaling to process his thoughts. He spent time with friends, allowing himself to laugh again, to reconnect with the person he used to be before everything had gone wrong. But it wasn't just about finding himself, it was about being a good father to Emma. She was his anchor, the reason he kept moving forward, even when every step felt like a struggle. He knew that no matter what happened with Mary, he had to be there for her, to show her that love, trust, and resilience were still possible. He didn't want her to see him broken. He wanted to be the father she deserved, the strong, supportive, and loving father who would help her navigate the challenges of life, no matter what they faced. As for Mary, their interactions remained minimal. James had made it clear that he wasn't ready to make any decisions about their future. He couldn't rush into forgiveness or reconciliation, not when the wound was still so fresh. He needed time to understand if he could ever trust her again, time to decide if their relationship was worth saving. One day, several months after the confrontation, Mary reached out to him again. This time, it wasn't for a confrontation or an apology. It was simply a message that said, "I'm working on myself, James. I hope you're doing the same." The simplicity of it hit him harder than he expected. She wasn't asking for forgiveness, and she wasn't asking for him to come back. She was simply acknowledging their separate journeys. And in that moment, James realized something. While they might never go back to what they once were, they didn't have to stay in the past either. He had taken the first steps toward healing, and now she was taking hers. It wasn't the kind of resolution he had imagined when everything first fell apart. There was no grand reconciliation, no magical return to how things used to be. But there was progress. There was a chance for both of them to grow, to learn from their mistakes, and to move forward in their own ways. James wasn't sure what the future held. Maybe he and Mary would find a way to rebuild what had been broken, maybe not. But he knew one thing for sure. He had found his strength again. He had learned to face the pain, to confront his feelings, and to take responsibility for his own happiness. He had learned that, no matter how much pain the past caused, he was capable of moving forward. And so, with a deep breath, he looked ahead. The road might be uncertain, but it was his to walk. And he was no longer afraid. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more stories of resilience, growth, and the human experience.